So, welcome to this class on Neuroscience of Human Movement. So, we will continue our discussion on cerebellum. So, this is part 6 of our discussion on cerebellum. So, in today's class we will be talking about the direct and indirect pathways that bring in different forms of information, afferent and efferent. What kind of information from the spinal cord? I am putting a question mark after efferent for a purpose. We will discuss that, and how Spinocerebellum is responsible for modulation of movements, and how vermis and the intermediate area, or at least the vermis and the flocculonodular lobe, are responsible for eye movement modulation. There are two types of eye movements that are present at saccades and smooth pursuits. So, this is basically the first class of at least two discussions on Spinocerebellum. Okay. So, in the last class we saw vestibulocerebellum and we discussed this case. So, that is the vestibulocerebellum. We discussed this. This is the vestibulocerebellum. And we said that receives information from the vestibular labyrinth via the vestibular nucleus, and then projects back to the vestibular nucleus, which is the equivalent of the deep cerebellar nucleus, and from then the vestibular nucleus projects directly to the vestibulospinal tract to provide some form of corrections, right. So, it is responsible for posture and balance in some sense, right. What also must have been discussed but was left out is that the vestibulocerebellum also projects to the cranial nerves via the vestibular nuclei. So, what are these cranial nerves? These cranial nerves are 3, 4 and 6. What are these cranial nerves? Cranial nerve 3, 4 and 6, these are oculomotor, trochlear and abducens. These are cranial nerves that are responsible for control of eye movements, right. So, something that the vestibulocerebellum also participates in. Okay. So, when discussing how Spinocerebellum receives inputs, it receives inputs through multiple modalities. So, you see spinal cord in multiple places here, spinal cord, spinal cord, spinal cord. It placed in 3 different places for convenience actually. So, that means the Spinocerebellum receives input through multiple pathways. One is, or one of the most important pathways, is the cuneocerebellar and other spinocerebellar tracks. Actually, there are 2 such tracks we will discuss in the future slides. Spinocerebellar and cuneocerebellar tracks, these are also called as variedly as the there are other names other than these. There are dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar pathways. So, these send different forms of information, either that may be afferent or sensory information, or efferent, or in other words commands that are sent to the motor neurons are also copied to the cerebellum. That might give you an idea of why or what could be the purpose or what could be the function of the cerebellum. We will continue that in the next few slides, this discussion. So, one source is the spinocerebellar, which are divided into 2 different types, basically dorsal and ventral, and cuneocerebellar and rostral spinocerebellar tracts. So, there are multiple pathways that project from the spinal cord directly into the spinocerebellum. So, that means these neurons become mossy fibers and project to the vermal and the intermediate zones in the cerebellum or the spinocerebellum. These are the massive fibers that project to the spinocerebellum, right. Also spinal cord projects to the inferior olivary complex or inferior olivary complex nuclei. From there obviously there is projection to the spinocerebellum. Also spinal cord projects indirectly, more indirectly via the reticular formation, where the following nuclei, these are the lateral reticular nucleus, reticularis tegmenti, pontis and paramedian reticular nucleus. So, there are 3 nuclei through, these are nuclei of the reticular formation. Through these 3 nuclei it projects to the spinal cord. Okay. So, these are the various inputs that are received by the spinocerebellum. Right. So, the spinocerebellum receives inputs from at least from 3 different sources, directly from through the spinocerebellar tracts and the cuneocerebellar tracts, or dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts and the cuneocerebellar tract and the rostral spinocerebellar tracts, right. And via the reticular formation, spinal cord reticular formation, and from reticular formation to the spinocerebellum, and via the inferior olive. Okay. So, these are the various inputs to the spinocerebellum. There is a reason why this is called as the spinocerebellum, right, because it receives information from the spinal cord and processes this information and probably outputs to the spinal cord. But let us remember that cerebellum does not directly project to the spinal cord, but rather its projections are indirect. This is something that we have discussed earlier, and so that is so then we will have to know how the cerebellum projects back to the spinal cord, how does it control or correct movements, right. So far we have seen the inputs, just erase this. Okay. So far we have seen the inputs. What are the outputs? So, what are the outputs, right? One output is from the spinocerebellum to the reticular formation, and it projects back to the spinal cord via the reticulospinal tract. Okay. The other output is to the red nucleus, and from the red nucleus to the rubrospinal tract, and the red nucleus also projects to the inferior olive. The other output is to the ventrolateral thalamus, and from the ventrolateral thalamus to the cerebral cortex or the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. This is the premotor area and primary motor cortex. A question is, if you are anyway going to project to the cerebral cortex and control via the corticospinal tract. So, that means if you are anyway going to perform the more fine control or modulate more finely, why have these? Why have reticulospinal, rubrospinal, these? No, and also what is not shown, this is the case of the spinocerebellum. In the vestibular cerebellum also there is projection to the vestibular nucleus, and from the vestibular nucleus back to the spinal cord via the vestibulospinal system. Note, the outcomes of these are not expected to be fine, right. They are expected to be quick, relatively fast responses, but not necessarily fine. Or maybe there are those parts of the body that require fine control that are not projected by these regions, such as the reticular formation and red nucleus, right. So there are multiple ways in which the spinocerebellum outputs. So, there are multiple ways in which it receives inputs, and there are also multiple ways in which it sends its outputs. What are the various inputs? One more time, the major inputs are the spinocerebellar tracts. These are the dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar tracts, and cuneocerebellar tract and the rostral spinocerebellar tract. And another major input is indirectly through the reticular formation, and we said what the nuclei of the reticular formation that that receive this sort of input, and another input is via the inferior olive. These are the major inputs to the spinocerebellum. And what are the major outputs? The major outputs are via the reticular formation and red nucleus. So, projecting respectively to the reticulospinal tract, and the red nucleus projecting to the rubrospinal tract, and the other output is via the thalamus, the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and from there to the cerebral cortex or the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, and to further from the cerebral cortex, from the motor areas to the corticospinal tract. So, these are the major inputs and outputs of the spinocerebellum. Right. So, what are the spinocerebellar tracks that we are talking about? What is presented here is one representation of multiple inputs and outputs. Here we are concerned only about the spinocerebellar tract. So, this is the posterior spinocerebellar tract, and this is the anterior spinocerebellar tract, right. So, that means these are also called as variedly as the dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar tracts. Okay. There, so these, so the dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar tracts start from the vertebra T1 and continue until about L3 L4, right. Then the question is, what about the vertebra C1 to C7, right, because in our discussion on spinal cord and vertebral column we said C1 to C7, then the thoracic vertebra, then the lumbar vertebra, sacral vertebra, and so on, and coccyx, is it not? This is our this is the order, right. So, if the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts are starting from T1 continuing until L3 L4, so basically they are bringing information from the thorax and parts below the thorax, right. For example, the hind limbs. What about the forelimbs and parts above the thorax, for example, the neck and the hand and arms, right. Those are brought about by the cuneo-cerebellar pathway, and the rostral spinocerebellar pathway, that is the name of, they are the analogues. These two are equivalent and these two are equivalent. Okay. The question is, what are the sorts of information that is brought by these? I will discuss some of these topics in this slide, and we will continue with the pathways in a bit. So, I will discuss these in this slide. So, what are the various sorts of information? First is information about the environment. What is going on in the environment? So, basically the environmental information, and the other information is from the organism. So, the organism's information, like for example, where are the various parts of your body, what is the relative position of your body parts with respect to each other, for example. So, you know the environmental situation, you know the relative position of the body parts, also the other. So, these are sensory informations, is it not? So, they are brought about by the dorsal side of the spinal cord. So, basically they are brought about by the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts. Also there is information that is sent to the spinal motor neurons that are sent to the cerebellum as well. So, that means alpha and gamma motor neurons receive commands from other systems, a copy of these commands is sent to the cerebellum. This is an important, this is a crucial principle called efference copy. From this I know not only the state of my body, I also know what is the command that is given to the particular limb or the particular body part or to the particular muscle, for example. So, from this I can compute, I want to make this movement, this is the environmental condition, this is how this is where the parts of my body are located, and this is the command I have given. Now, what is the actual output? The actual output also is measurable, right, is also something that I know once again from proprioceptive information. So, I know that I am making an attempt to perform the movement, then I can compare, this is the sensory state, the original earlier state. So, basically initial state I know. I also know command given. What is the command given? By command given, I mean the command that is given to the muscle is copied to the cerebellum, right? That is the efference copy. By the way, if you give a command, it does not mean that you will be in a position to exactly execute what is intended, right. So, you also know the final state. What is the goal? The goal is also you know the intended state, you know the initial state, you also know the intended state. How do you know the intended state? Actually, the intended state is known through other pathways not discussed in this class, we will discuss in future classes. But so, I know what I want to do, I know where I am to at this moment, I know what is the command that has been given, I also know what is the final state. The goal is to ensure that the final state is the same as the intended state. These two must be the same. If they are not the same, then there must be a correction that must be made, is it not? Approximately, I am presenting as if the cerebellum is a computer and it follows a set of rules or algorithm. Actually, this is not true. Approximately, this is what is going on. The system is trying to compare the difference between the actual state and the intended state, and how or whether the command that is given is able to achieve the intended state, right. So, that how do you know? So, crucial to this is the information on the efference copy or the information that is given to the muscle. This is important because I have an object that is, sometimes we may have an object that turns out to be heavier than expected, or the physics is different from what is expected. Then you have to make appropriate corrections to the command that you are giving. Suppose imagine that there is this box, okay, you know you are not able to see what is inside this box. So, this box you are not able to see what is inside. Let us say that this box is kept on a table, suppose that is a table and there is a box kept on the table. I am saying okay, lift it. From your observation and previous experience, you think okay, this is a box that is made of cardboard, you are able to see that this is made of cardboard, and you would expect it to be of mass about say 100 grams or less, reasonable expectation, or you would expect that there might be some object that is kept that might weigh a little more than 100 grams, maybe a few hundred grams. Let us suppose that it is completely filled with lead or very heavy objects and it weighs several kilograms. I am asking okay, just take it with one hand, just lift it, right. As you are lifting, you realize that its mass is much greater than what was originally thought of, what you originally expected. Then what you do? There are corrections that are made. How do you? So, initially you expect a particular mass, and the command that is generated to lift or to that lifting muscles, the muscles that perform the lifting action receive particular commands, and that command is not able to execute the task, that command is not able to achieve the intended state. Then you realize this is the command I gave, it is not able to bring the or make the final state similar to the or same as the intended state. Then what you do? You make corrections, right. once again a very crude example of what is going on. What is actually going on is way more fine than what was described now. Okay. Other than this, so based on this we know that the cerebellum, or at least the hypothesis is that the cerebellum somehow compares these various states and then changes commands appropriately. So how does it change the command? By the way, if it changes the command, it is not going to be able to directly communicate that to the spinal cord. It is going to be able to do that via only the reticulospinal pathway or the rubrospinal pathway, or via the ventrolateral thalamus to the cortex and via the corticospinal pathway, right. We have discussed this. So the information is coming from Spinocerebellar tracks. What are these tracks? We have said what these tracks are. These are the dorsal Spinocerebellar tracks. This is also called as the posterior thoracic nucleus, or the posterior thoracic system, or the posterior thoracic pathway, right. And ventral, whenever we say ventral, we are immediately reminded that the ventral part of the spinal cord is responsible for motor functions, right. So same input as alpha motor neuron, gamma motor neuron, or the spinal motor neuron inputs are the efferent copy. So this is actually afferent to the spinocerebellum. This is actually afferent to the cerebellum, but this is bringing an efferent copy. So I am giving a command. Let us suppose I am giving a command, or I am giving a request to one of my students. I am copying it to somebody else, right, to ensure that they are doing that. And their analogues, basically the cuneo and the rostral spinocerebellar pathways, right. And it is known now that this is happening via that these two perform different actions by experiments or animals. For example, if there is a decerebrate cat, right, and if it is walking, it's that you measure that there is rhythmic activity of both the dorsal and the ventral pathways. When the dorsal roots are cut, the dorsal pathway becomes silent, whereas the ventral pathway continues to produce this rhythmic activity, right. So these pathways start from the spinocerebellar tract and end at the interposed nuclei, right. What are these interposed nuclei? Emboliform and globose nuclei, is it not? And from there project to the red nucleus and to lateral descending tract. Please note that there is crossover of some. So this is via the superior peduncle. So there is crossover of these tracts from one side to the other side, and from the red nucleus back to the descending tract there is one more crossover. We said early on that the cerebellum control is ipsilateral, or the same side, right. That does not necessarily mean that all the projections will also have to be on the same side. For example, in this particular case we saw that the crossover is happening two times. Once it crosses from the left side to the right side, and then from the right side back to the left side. So there is a double crossover, ensuring that the same side of the body is still being controlled or modulated by the cerebellum, right. Also through the reticular formation, inputs from the reticular formation through the fastigial nucleus, right, and to the vestibular nucleus and the vestibulospinal tract. We say that the cerebellum modulates movement, or it performs initiation and modulation, but rather than not control per se, but rather modulation. This is because of course this is because that it does not directly project to the spinal cord, but also let us remember that the spinal neurons receive inputs from multiple descending systems, from red nucleus, from reticular formation, from the cortex, from various such systems, from vestibular nucleus and so on and so forth. So, the inputs from the cerebellum can only modulate the outcome to some extent, but not control. What is the difference? The difference is that when you mean control, you are talking about moment to moment control or fineness of control, right. Of course, such control is going to be possible from the cortical regions, but not necessarily through the regions that are other regions such as the red nucleus, reticular formation, etc., right. So, there is only movement modulation that is performed by the cerebellum, not necessarily control. Also, it is known that the middle region, that the more medial region of the cerebellum is called as the vermis. We saw that early on. It is known that the vermis is believed to be responsible for control of saccades. Some information about the pathways involved are also known. It is believed that this is through the caudal fastigial nucleus and reticular formation, or the saccade generator circuit that is located within the reticular formation, right. Also, we saw in the previous class that smooth pursuit is performed with the help of the lateral part of the flocculonodular lobe. The exact pathway remains unknown, the exact pathway, but it is definitely, at least what is at least known is that there are more synaptic relays than this case. So, saccades have a smaller number of synapses, whereas smooth pursuits have more number of synapses, and that makes sense, right, because saccades are fast control or fast changes or sudden changes, whereas smooth pursuit involve moment to moment control, more smoother. So, of course, the exact pathway continues to be elusive. We have not been able to identify that. Also, it is hypothesized that vermis plays a crucial role in motor learning. What is motor learning? Motor learning refers to this phenomenon where there is a correction in errors that are made either in the short term or in the long term, especially when it comes to saccade and smooth pursuit correction, error corrections. It is believed that vermis plays a crucial role. So, actually it turns out that the cerebellum performs two forms of error correction. One is called as motor learning, the other is called as adaptation, the other is simply called as error correction. This is online error correction. So, motor learning refers to this phenomenon where skills are learnt over practice or through extensive practice over several days or months or years. So, refers to this long term changes, right. Adaptation on the other hand in general refers to short term or learning of more of associations that can be learnt or unlearnt or relearnt, right. Online error corrections are those that are really short term, that happen now and that is it, right. So, cerebellum probably participates in all these, and then a question is, how does the cerebellum do that? That is because that is through, it is at least a controversial hypothesis in the function of the cerebellum is through the use of internal models. This is an interesting but controversial hypothesis that the system somehow controls specific aspects of movements and learns and unlearns specific aspects are through these internal models. Okay. So, in summary, we have seen direct and indirect pathways. Direct are spinocerebellar pathways, indirect are those that go via the reticular formation, and how movement is modulated, not controlled, by the spinocerebellum, and how eye movements are modulated by the vermis. What do you mean by eye movements? Saccades and smooth pursuit. So, with this we come to the end of this class. We will continue the discussion on spinocerebellum in the next class. Thank you very much.